The sedan slammed its brakes and left fresh rubber across the asphalt. A man in a dark coat tore out of the driver's door with a hand pressed to his side. Emma Hayes had fear at the back of her throat the instant his heavy steps reached the tail of her crippled compact. She smelled smoke from the other car and felt the desert air cut cold against her skin. Within 3 sentences, she understood the stakes. A violent night had spilled into this shoulder of road, and the man advancing toward her did not look like someone who asked questions. Emma bent over the dented bonnet to sort a loose cable when the man slammed the trunk and the car lights washed her face. She looked up and met Hazel eyes that narrowed like a hinge. She did not introduce herself with a name. She answered with a small, clear motion. She slid a hand into her satchel and kept it visible as the man stepped closer. Marco Villano did not shout. He did not need to. He let the silence do the work until Luca and a driver called Diego backed the mood with a low vehicle rumble. Marco's jaw tightened. The lines beside his mouth were sharper under the amber streetlight. The problem was concrete. Anger with nowhere private to go, a group waiting at the edge of violence, and a stranger in a broken car who could not be left to chance. "Marco, who are you?" And the single question landed like an order. Emma put both hands on the satchel strap and kept her voice small and steady. "My name is Emma." My car stalled. I saw lights and thought. Luca's shadow moved like a blade at the trunk. She saw something, boss. Luca's words tightened the air into a hard, thin thread. The crew assumed a worse story than a stranded motorist. They assumed a witness. Emma heard the assumption and felt the lawless logic reach for her like a gloved hand. She could have climbed back into her car and locked the door. Fear pushed her toward that choice. Instead, she stood and pulled from her bag a small, crumpled pharmacy bag and a folded receipt. She put them on the bumper where the light hit the paper and where everyone could see. The paper had a hospital stamp and the name of an emergency triage unit. Blood had soaked one corner. That scrap was the first unexpected fact of the night. Luca whistled under his breath and took a step close to the trunk again. Diego kept the engine idling slow and watched Marco's face for permission. Emma's hands did not shake when she pushed the scrap forward with the heel of her palm. "This is mine," she said. "I was bringing supplies for a man who couldn't drive." "He for help? Isn't he dead?" Her voice did not plead, it described. The group stopped on a single pivot. Marco's glance moved from paper to woman to trunk. He put a gauntlet of a hand on the trunk and eased it open a crack, long enough to see a blanket and a boot. Luca's breath came faster. He read the visible smear and lifted a gloved hand toward his jacket. Emma stepped between Luca and the trunk and forced herself to speak again. "Call an ambulance if you need one," she said. "Take him anywhere safe first." He me to find help. The first emotion that had flooded her, fear, began to curve. It turned into something else. A cautious curiosity at the man behind the coat. Emma noticed the small scar that cut through Marco's eyebrow, and she noticed that his hands trembled just enough to betray strain. She used those details as tools. She did not claim understanding she did not have. She named simple, practical steps. "Marco, why would a woman carry this?" And Luca cut. "Maybe she lies." Diego kept his head low, fingers on the wheel. Back and forth chatter erupted like a brittle match. "Maybe she lies," Luca repeated. "She could be a plant." "She isn't a plant, Emma." I was on my way to the clinic. I stopped because my engine died. The man in the back asked for gauze. I ran back into my car for my bag when your light passed by. 3-4 short lines. Marco looked at Luca. Luca's eyes flicked to Diego, then back. The conversation hardened into a small, urgent test. "Marco, what's your name?" Emma repeated it. "Emma Hayes." Marco's voice was low. Emma stepped back. She moved a measured pace. When she stopped, she reached for the small pendant at her throat, not to touch it, only to steady her hands. She saw Luca's thumb brush the seam of his coat toward a weapon. That movement set the next level of pressure. An external event pushed through the tense geometry. The sound of another engine, far off but getting closer. Daigo's head turned. The new vehicle's headlights carved thin bars across the desert. Marco took that moment to make the situation his. He slapped his hand flat on the trunk, Diego doors. Now the men moved like one machine. Din Nemaz's second emotion shift arrived in that rush. The fear that had kept her still moved into something quieter, steadier tension. She watched for patterns, she watched men. She catalogued movements that mattered. She could not let panic replace observation. She kept her hands visible and kept speaking in short sentences. Luca walked around the back of the sedan and leaned to peer into the trunk. A torn sheet of paper fluttered out and caught on the bumper. He picked it up and saw a partial address and a name. He hissed, "This isn't clean." He jerked his chin toward the darker stretch of roadside. "This looks like someone left a body." Emma did not flinch. She pulled from her satchel a different scrap, folded small, with a printed stamp and the logo of the emergency room. She placed it next to the torn paper so the men could compare them under the amber glare. The two scraps told opposite stories. One suggested a violent dump. The other carried a medic stamp and a recent address note. Luca muttered, then spat a curse. Marco moved close enough that Emma could read the lines beneath his lower lashes. He smelled of cold tobacco and cedar. "Why are you in the dark here? Why did you stop?" Emma kept her voice even. "My car stalled. I waited for help. When I saw you stop, I thought you were a passerby. I didn't want to leave a man I couldn't lift without help." Across 3 quick exchanges, Luca pushed the tension toward a knife edge. He stepped for the trunk, and his hand brushed leather. For the first time that night, someone else made a choice that altered the shape of danger. Luca's fingers hovered over metal. The movement promised violence. Emma moved faster than she expected. She reached forward and laid her palm flat on the trunk between Luca's hand and the opening. Her touch was not frantic. It was an anchored, slow pressure that stopped the hand in transit. Emma spoke with a tone that did not try to charm or plead. She used the quiet of blunt facts. "Luca," she said, using the name as an anchor, "please. If he's hurting him more, fix it. Call Marco if you need confirmation, but don't open anything you can close." Luca's jaw worked. He withdrew his hand a fraction. In the tight ring of headlights, Marco watched the exchange like a measured judge. He glanced at Emma's palm on the trunk and then at her eyes. For a long second he did nothing but look at the woman who had interrupted a violent rhythm. That look altered Marco's body. He blinked once. He steadied his hand on his coat. The engine noise of the approaching vehicle had faded into a distant wash. Marco's control tightened and loosened at once. He ordered, "Get out of the car, Luca. Pull back, Diego. Stay with me," Luca sputtered, but he stepped back. The chapter's central climax arrived when Luca's hand retreated but his eyes stayed hard. "You understand what this is, Emma?" Marco did not force her to answer. She spoke because the room required it. "I understand a man was hurt and a woman went to help. Emma, if you want to arrest someone, search for them properly. If you want to make sure no one else gets hurt, drive him to a hospital." Her voice was small, exact, and she pushed forward one more practical detail. "Check the boot now. If he is breathing, call an ambulance." Marco's face changed like a machine adjusting gears. He did not reply with softness. He only said, "Diego." Diego slid across and opened his car door. His fingers moved slow. "Marco, boss, should I pull them closer to the highway?" Marco nodded once. He did not take his eyes off Emma. The men took action instead of argument. Diego walked around the sedan and opened the trunk wider. A thin strip of warm night air escaped. The blanket shifted and a booted foot showed. The sight was concrete and simple. A limp shoulder, a head tucked in shadow. Marco leaned in, then straightened as if the sight had reset an instrument panel. That moment produced the chapter's mini cliffhanger. Luca began to step forward again with a tightened hand. "We don't know what she did. We don't know who she called, boss. We should..." Marco held up his palm like a judge ending a sentence. "Not tonight. Marco. His voice carried finality. Emma felt an odd looseness where the fear had lived earlier, and a newer layer of attention solidified. She had moved through fear to curiosity, and now toward a steadier compassion that kept her hands calm. She realized she was not certain she was safe. She was certain she had a role to play. Diego closed the trunk gently. Marco breathed through his nose, and then spoke directly to Emma. "You me your name. Why would you help a stranger at 1 in the morning?" His question was not a demand. It was a practical probe. Emma answered with a short sentence and a clear image. "I carry a bag for people who need small things. Bandages, painkillers, a phone charger. I keep it because my mother taught me to hand what I could." Marco's mouth moved in the barest of smiles. He did not soften otherwise. "You're reckless for a woman alone on this road, Emma." "Maybe." But he asked. The exchange closed the immediate argument and opened another. Why Marco's crew assumed murder when first they saw blood. Lucas' voice cut across again. "We still don't know if you're clean, Emma. We could take you in until we find out." The threat held weight. Marco's hand went to his coat for a breath, then stopped. Emma looked at Marco. She measured him the way someone measures the temperature of water before touching it. She offered the single, unexpected thing she had. "Steadiness. If you need me, I'll answer questions. If you want me gone, let me walk away now. But don't use him as an excuse to hurt people who don't deserve it." Her sentence was short. Her brisk moral shape clattered against the men's assumptions. Marco let out a low sound that might have been a laugh. "Diego, bring her in." For tonight, Diego blinked and gave a small nod. No one spoke for a beat. Marco's crew shifted. Luca glanced at Marco, then at Emma, then at the road. The new car that had circled away earlier now returned slowly and kept its distance. The practical decision arrived. They would move rather than risk staying. Marco leaned once more toward Emma and almost touched her shoulder. His movement was small and precise. He did not apologize. "You ride with me. We will stop where it's safe." Emma felt a tangle of relief and warning. She nodded and closed her fingers around the strap of her satchel. She moved to the open back seat of Marco's car and sat where Diego opened the door. The leather was cool under her palm. The engine revved and the lights cut through the dark. As the sedan pulled away, Emma looked back at the roadside cluster of headlights and figures. Luca stood with his hands in his coat, chewing a thought. Diego sat rigid, watching the rearview mirror. Marco drove with a steady, precise hand on the wheel. He did not speak. Inside the car, Emma kept her hands visible on her lap. She felt the car's movement translate into a physical rhythm against the back of her thighs. Marco's presence sat at the front like a steady weight. She could still feel the tremor of his earlier anger in the set of his shoulders. Diego glanced once at Emma and asked, "You okay?" Emma answered, "I'll be fine. Thank you." Her voice was small and true. Marco did not respond. He kept his gaze on the ribbon of highway, and the lights of Las Vegas glinted distant and blue. The chapter closed on a concrete action. Marco ordered the sedan to fold its speed to a protective crawl and directed Diego to follow an exit marked for a rest stop with a lighted sign. Emma felt the pull of tiredness in her shoulders and kept a hold on her satchel like a tether. Her night had changed from a single broken car to a position inside someone else's machine of protection. The last image in the passenger window was a thumbprint of amber headlight on the cracked asphalt. Marco's men melted into the dark behind them, and the sedan carried Emma and a man who did not yet show softness, only control. The car eased onto the ramp and the engine hummed low. Diego, stop at the first lit lot. We'll wait there until the dawn traffic clears." Diego nodded and followed the instruction. The car rolled toward a small pool of light. Emma put her cheek against the cool leather and breathed once, counting the breath in a practical way. She could feel fear, curiosity, and a slow, careful steadiness layered inside her. The night had not resolved, but the immediate danger had been contained. Marco kept the road in front of them. Emma kept her hands on her bag. The sedan eased into the lit lot and stopped. Marco killed the engine with a single, soft motion. Diego opened the passenger door. "Marco, stay." Emma nodded. She stepped out onto gravel dusted with sand, felt the cold of the metal step, and glanced up at Marco. He watched her like a man holding a measurement in his eyes. Then, without a word, he walked to the trunk and pulled out a blanket. He handed it to Diego with a short instruction to circle the lot and keep his eyes open. Emma took the blanket and folded it over her lap. The night kept its edges crisp. The car's taillights bled into the dark. The chapter ended on Marco's short, concrete decision. He had chosen to move her off the dangerous shoulder and into the shelter of his car for the night. The choice was an action, not a statement. It promised questions and tests, but for now it provided containment. Emma walked around the car, closed the door, and sat again with the blanket across her knees while Marco tightened his glove and looked at the highway. The engine stayed silent. Outside, the desert held its sand and the distant thrum of the city. Marco slammed his palm on Emma's wrist and dragged her away from the hood, the motion sharp enough to hurt. Suspicion tightened in Emma's throat. She tasted metal and desert dust. Men shouted from the sedan. The wounded man on the asphalt moaned. The conflict was immediate. Marco shoved, he named her, and the night demanded answers before she had a chance to speak. Emma kept her face steady. She had seen a car skid earlier that left rubber on the road. She remembered the sudden stop, the way the passenger door had flown open. And that memory made her heart beat faster now. Marco, I am not with them, and the name fell like a small, raw sound into the amber light. Marco's jaw worked. He looked at her as if assessing how much of his life she might take. He pressed her toward the sedan and hissed, "Who are you?" The word held command. Emma's hands found the torn hem of her cardigan and she folded them, then forced a plain answer, "My name is Emma Hayes. I was driving home from the diner. I found him on the shoulder." Her voice stayed low. She kept her palms visible, fingers splayed to show she carried nothing hidden. Marco's suspicion did not lift. He stepped closer, so close that Emma could read the lines at his temples and the silver on his hair. "You saw something you shouldn't have," he said. He put measured weight on each word. He wanted certainty. Suspicion pushed him like a second skin. Emma felt the night's danger press at the edges of her ribs, then shift into a wire of clear choice. Rico and Enzo moved the wounded courier with the practiced force of men who handled broken things for a living. Blood soaked the courier's shirt. Rico's voice came quick and low. "We need bandages." Now Enzo dropped a roll into Emma's lap, and it felt heavy as a judgment. Marco shoved Emma toward the back seat and ordered, "Help him, Emma. Tie it tight." His voice had the bluntness of someone who gave orders so often they had worn away, the softness in every sentence. Emma's hands shook once, then steadied. She had wrapped sprains at the diner, tended to a boy who cut his palm on a can of peaches. She had bound kitchen burns and apologized for spilling coffee. These are small, concrete things she knew how to do. She tore the cloth into strips and pressed them to the courier's side, feeling warm blood through her fingers. The action became a way to keep her brain clear. Each movement answered the suspicion with work. Rico barked a direction and Enzo lifted the courier's head. "Name," Marco demanded sharply. The wounded man breathed raggedly and murmured a name that meant nothing to Emma, then coughed and spat a street curse. Marco watched every breath, as if the courier's sound could tell him who had set the night wound in motion. Headlights grazed the shoulder like a question. A patrol car's faint wail threaded the air beyond the scrub. Marco's shoulders tightened. His temper tightened with them, but Emma noticed the way his hands slowed when he saw the courier's face. That small hesitation moved Marco from raw suspicion toward a guarded curiosity. "Emma, the man helped me last week with my tire. He handed me a folded receipt for engine oil. He is from town." The detail lodged inside the tense air like a nail. Marco's eyes flicked to the courier, then to Emma. "Which town?" he asked. The tone shifted. Investigation now. Miller's by the service station off Route 9. Emma, his name is Danny Mendez. He gave me change when my card declined. Her voice pushed facts at him the way a handyman crams wedges under a loose board. Rico cursed under his breath. Enzo glanced at Marco, waiting. The sedan's engine hummed with impatient heat. Marco made the decision to move. He ordered the driver to pull back onto the road. The conversation shortened into commands. Get him inside. Wrap the wound tight. Watch for shock. Marco's control filled the space like a solid object. They slid back onto the asphalt, and the desert opened around them, black and flat, with a rim of distant Vega's light pretending to be far away. The convoy formed. One sedan moving slow, another car trailing like a shadow. Emma breathed shallowly. Fear arrived as a clear, precise thing. Her hands tightened on the gauze, fingers clamping at the edge of the wound. She nothing for a moment, listening to the plastic crinkle and the courier's labored breath. Rico kept one eye on the rear view. We have company, he said. Not patrol. Rival rods. Fast. Marco's mouth was a hard line. They'll try to take him back. Marco, they'll try to take him, and they'll spill more blood. We move fast, and we make them think he's gone. Marco's answer was strategy. Emma blinked. Suspicion gave way to immediate concern for the wounded man. Her emotional path shifted again, from feeling suspected to feeling responsible. Emma placed a hand on the courier's shoulder. He's going to be okay if we keep pressure, she said. He lost a lot. He needs rest and a tourniquet lower than this. Her voice had the directness of someone laying out a first aid plan. Marco listened. Emma watched his jaw flex. Do it, he said at last. The convoy accelerated in a careful, timed way. A rival vehicle flashed past and then slammed its lights into their mirrors as if to split the night open. Bullets kicked up dust on the asphalt. Rico reported, "They retrying to box us." The sedan swerved, tires throwing sand, and Marco barked orders, evasive right. Enzo, return fire if needed. Rico, keep that man breathing. The scene folded into violent motion. The driver's knuckles white on the wheel, a shout, the serrated sound of automatic fire. Emma's hands went cold. She tightened the bandage with a motion meant to hold both wound and composure. A bullet smashed a headlight and glass, sprayed like brittle promises. She felt a heat at the base of her skull. The body sold, clean reaction to danger, then tuned it down by counting breaths. Marco's voice was close then, not harsh but clipped. Keep him still, Emma. Eyes up. Watch left. He leaned into the curve as if his body could steer them through menace. A rival car swung in front to block the lane. Santino stepped out under the glare of headlights, his silhouette ablaze against the flat wash. He shouted a demand for the courier by name. Marco eased the sedan sideways and killed the engine, folding the night into a tense hush. Santino, Marco. He kept his voice cold, even. Santino spat a name and moved closer, men fanning behind him like a mouth opening. The standoff ignited. Santino wanted the courier. Marco refused. The men argued in quick bursts. Give him to us. You know what he did? Santino, no. Marco answered. We done trade men for debts. Words became threats. Enzo's fingers brushed the pistol at his hip. Rico planted his boots. Emma stayed with the wounded man and watched the negotiation turn physical. Santino shoved forward. Enzo stepped in and the shove became a shove back. The first hit landed hard on a spare tire. Someone slipped in the gravel. A gun fired without warning. The sound split the air and then a body moved wrong. Marco shouldered a man aside and the motion placed him between Emma and the danger. He shoved, then pulled, then steadied. A stray bullet cracked against the sedan's trunk and sent sparks up like angry metal flowers. Emma froze long enough to hear the courier murmur, "He's my brother," then choke. The revelation landed like a sudden map change. It altered how she and Marco looked at the wounded man. Marco's face cleared to a different kind of intent. He barked, "Hold him down. Make it look like the end." Rico staged the scene. The voice carried the weight of a decision. Emma heard the plan and felt her stomach drop. Deception now sat on the table. She stepped closer and touched the courier's cheek. "Danny?" she asked. He blinked and tried to form a smile that failed. Enzo worked with calculated movements, arranging clothes and a broken bottle as props. Marco directed the choreography like someone arranging a puppet show. "For survival, we fake his death. Rivals will take him and we keep them running." Marco. The plan smelled of risk. Emma hesitated. "We can lie about a man like this," she said. "We can write a funeral for someone still breathing." Her voice trembled on the edge of argument. Marco turned at her, and for the first time in the night his temper softened into something awkward. "Emma," he said, "not a command, a partial explanation. If we don't lie, more will die. You saw what happened out there. You want him saved, done you." He had the bluntness of a man who measures outcomes in lives. She looked at Danny's shallow breaths, at the slick of blood on his collarbone, at the small tremble in his fingers when she touched his knuckle. She had to choose. This was the chapter's pivot. Protect the man by deceiving others, or refuse and risk pursuers returning with worse intent. Her hands tightened on the gauze and then relaxed. "I'll help," she said. Her voice contained an action as much as a choice. Rico moved with the efficiency of someone who had practiced lies until they looked like truth. He arranged clothing, shifted the courier's limbs, smudged blood to match a wound that could not be easily read from a distance. Enzo played the dead neighbor. Santino's men crept forward to inspect, knives catching the amber light. Santino leaned in, smelling the staged scene. He spat and made a low sound of disappointment. They talked among themselves. Marco watched every face for a twitch that might show the lie. At the edge of the turnout, under the roadside lamp, Marco pulled Emma aside. He held a glove between his fingers and his voice was abrupt. "You did fine," he said. There was no flourish in the praise. It was a small, factual sentence. Emma's chest loosened in a way that felt like breath returning. "Why did you help him?" he asked. The question was blunt, almost curious. "Because he handed me change when my card failed," she answered. "Because I done like people dying if something can be done." Her reply was plain and stubborn. Marco studied her. She saw the chill of tobacco and cedar in the line of his mouth. He adjusted a ring on his finger and then, with an almost invisible motion, put his hand on the courier's shoulder to steady his head. For a second his fingers trembled as if the night's weight had struck him. Emma noticed that tremor and the way it made him human for a single breath. Her emotional pattern shifted again, from fear to a careful tenderness that surprised her. Santino's men pulled back, fooled by the stage corpse and the convincing props. They drove off with angry brakes and curses. The convoy watched them go until the taillights disappeared. Marco exhaled through his nose in a sound Emma took as permission to release from caution. They had bought time. Instead of gratitude, Emma felt a new complexity. She had been accused, she had helped, she had lied. Each action moved her further into complicity. Rico came up behind the sedan, hands smeared with stage blood. "We need to move now," he said. "Patrol will be up soon." "We can be here when dawn comes," Marco nodded. "Get the courier inside properly. Cover tracks. We'll drive slow and keep him out of sight until we can get him patched." The orders were practical, coldly precise. They arranged the courier in the back seat like a fragile package. Emma sat beside him, bandaged hands pressed to his wound as if to anchor him to this side of the night. Marco watched her through the rearview mirror. For a long minute he said nothing. Then he asked in emotion that softened the rough edges of command. "Who are you?" "Emma Hayes." He used her full name. She answered. "I work the morning shift at Lena's Diner. I live in a small room above the hardware store. I drive an old hatchback that stalls in cold weather." The details felt ridiculous under the weight of the desert, but Marco listened as if details mattered. He wanted to know she had roots, that her story had edges, that she was not a planted threat. The facts anchored her in a way his suspicion could measure. Rico drove with a tension coiled in his jaw. Enzo rode left and kept watch. Marco slid into the front passenger seat and folded his hands. He looked at Emma once, then away, as if to test the distance between them. The car picked up speed, and the desert swallowed the taillights of the rival cars. The convoy moved like a ribbon being pulled back toward the city. They crossed a stretch of road where the asphalt gleamed faintly under a distant neon horizon. Emma's hands felt sticky inside the gloves she borrowed from the courier. She folded them in her lap and struck a match to light a cigarette she did not want. Marco's gaze flicked to her, then to the bandaged man. "You did good work," he said. His voice had the weight of a man admitting an uncommon truth. Emma could not let the night close without one more attempt at clarity. "Why did you stop me at the hood?" She asked. "Why assume I was part of it?" Marco's jaw flexed. He gave a short answer that landed with the sound of an old pain. "Because suspicion keeps men alive," he said. "Because a mistake costs people their heads." The sentence was a lesson forged in ruthless history. She thought of the wounded courier again, of how his small kindness to her had bound them together through a particular chain of events. She thought of the man Marco had shielded her from a bullet for. His hand on her shoulder had been an instinct to protect. That smallness unsettled something in her. "You didn't have to shield me," she said. "You could have left us to the road." Marco looked at her fully then. "I didn't," he replied. They drove on toward the glow of Las Vegas, the city a distant promise of anonymity and help. Emma sat with Danny and watched his chest rise and fall. Her emotion tracked through suspicion, fear, responsibility, and a careful tenderness that she did not expect. The night's events had rearranged the edges of what she believed about strangers and protection. As dawn lulled the sky from black to ink blue, Marco made a practical decision to mislead anyone who might come looking. He instructed Rico to leave behind carefully staged signs of violence and a severed trail. They pulled off the road at a shallow ditch and worked quickly, while Emma kept pressure on the wound. The concrete task of manipulating evidence burned through helplessness into a strange competence. When they climbed back into the sedan, Marco offered Emma his long wool overcoat. She wrapped it around her shoulders. The fabric smelled of cedar and tobacco. She nothing. Marco started the engine. The convoy crept forward as the first pale fingers of light grazed the horizon. The Chapter S small conflict closed. The courier was alive, the rivals deceived, and they had bought temporary safety. But safety was not comfort. Marco's eyes lingered on Emma a moment longer than necessary. "You could go now," he said. "You don't have to stay for what comes next." The suggestion sounded like a release. Emma looked at the car's interior, at the blood-smudged upholstery, at the gauze knotted around the courier's ribs. "I want to leave him," she answered. The answer set a new condition between them. It changed what Marco had expected. Marco paused the car at the highway's shoulder, then reached into his glove compartment and pulled out a small, folded letter. An envelope stamped with a code she did not recognize. He handed it across the console to Emma. "Keep this until we know he is safe," he said. "Don't open it unless you need to contact someone who can help him properly." The instruction was practical, heavy with implied trust. Emma took the envelope. She felt its edges against her palm and the weight of what she had agreed to: complicity, deception, watchfulness. Outside, the dawn light sharpened the desert scrub into hard shapes. Inside the sedan, the engine idled steady. Rico checked the rear view and said, "Move." Now Marco started the car, and the convoy rolled toward the faint Vegas lights. Enzo's hand found the pistol at his thigh and left it there. Emma pressed the envelope into her satchel, fingers folding around the paper like a promise she hadn't made. They drove into the oncoming city, the night's violence folding behind them into tracks and dust. At the highway's edge, as the first billboard came into view, Marco turned and said, quietly, "Stay with him." For now, Emma slid the satchel on, felt the letter press against her ribs, and answered with a short, steady voice. "I will." Marco glanced ahead, set his jaw, and eased the sedan into traffic. The convoy swallowed them toward the bright, complicated promise of help, and toward decisions none of them could avoid. The sedan screamed onto gravel and shoved itself to a halt at the overlook. 3 masked men stepped from a second car and cut off every exit. Fear tightened Emma Hayes' throat and made her hands clamp the satchel strap until her knuckles went white. The central problem was immediate. Emma's presence inside Marco Villano's car had drawn a line of guns and names across the desert, and whoever controlled those names would decide whether she walked away. She remembered the sound of the seedless brakes, how the tires had left fresh rubber across the asphalt in an earlier moment, and the quick, rough motion when Marco had yanked her wrist 2 nights before. That memory pushed her out of her seat and toward the open door. Outside, headlamps made hard discs of light on sand. Marco's voice cut a space for orders. Raffle, move. The name between men changed the angle of danger. Emma tracked the way Marco's shoulders squared and his jaw clenched. Fear shifted into sharpened attention. She did not run. She stepped instead to the lip of the car, letting the cold desert wind tug at her cardigan. Marco's presence read like a barrier. He moved with a practiced stillness that filled the small circle of light. He kept his hands where she could see them, the matte silver signet ring catching a strip of amber. Emma watched the ring. She watched the scar on his eyebrow. She watched the long wool coat fall open and the leather driving gloves rest heavy in his hand. Each detail turned danger into a shape she could understand and measure. That steady observation guided what she did next. A masked man shoved forward and shouted, "Hands up. Both of you out of the car." The man's voice had a local edge, clipped and certain. Marco's driver door opened. He moved first and hooked his arm under Emma's, not gently. The motion came with force and with ownership. She felt the bruise bloom along her wrist from yesterday's pull. Irritation rose in Emma, and with it another change of feeling, suspicion. She suspected this ambush wasn't random. She suspected someone inside Marco's network had given these men their coordinates. That suspicion tightened her jaw. It made her watch Rafal's face more closely when Rafal shouted back toward the masked men. Rafal rounded the back of the car with a pistol half visible beneath his coat. His voice was flat. "Who gave you our route?" "Speak now." He pointed at Sergio's men. Sergio, standing a step behind the masked two, held his hands too calm. Emma did not know Sergio's history beyond a name Marco had spat earlier, but she knew how names landed in Marco's mouth, like reports. The first external event came fast. One of the masked men lunged, and Raphael stepped forward to intercept. Hands scrambled, feet kicked up gravel, and Raphael pushed the attacker back. Marco shoved Emma behind him. She tasted metal on her tongue and smelled diesel and dust. The sky above the Vega's glow looked thin and distant. Concrete danger was closer. Emma's intervention arrived without dramatics. She moved in the space between Marco and the masked man who had pressed too close. She put both palms up, flat and visible. "Stop, Emma." Her voice was low. "Wait." She used that single word 3 times like a tool, not like a plea. The command collapsed the split second that would have let fists fly or a trigger be pulled. Marco's hand tightened on her shoulder. He did not push her away. A second emotional shift. Fear loosened into a different current, calm resolve. Emma felt the change in her limbs. She felt her breathing steady and the memory of the wounded man on the asphalt come back as a physical list of sights. A torn shirt cuff, a split cheek, and the copper taste she had tasted when she touched dry blood on a sleeve. Those images gave her words. "Listen, Emma, you came for a fight. I know nothing about your deals. But killing him here now only trades one problem for another." Her eyes found Marco's. "Marco, look at me." She named him so the rawness of the moment had an anchor. The men around them paused. Marco's voice was close. "Emma, get back in the car." He did not say please. His jaw worked. Rafal jabbed a finger at Sergio. "You set us up. Rafal, you led them here." Sergio smiled without humor. "You shouldn't assume, Rafal. You should ask. The exchange produced a line of rapid back and forth. Rafael, Marco, answer. I didn't. Rafael started. You did, Sergio. You signed for protection. You took money. Rafael's face went unreadable. The four-man argument sped through three short, staccato replies and raised voices that bent around the line of cars. Another external event cut through. Ivo, the wounded man from earlier, cuffed and tried to move on the ground near the tires. Blood had dried into the sand beside him. Rafael dropped his bluff and went to him, hands bright with that same dark stain. He bent, checked the man's pocket, and fumbled out a folded scrap of paper. He held it up. The light caught a name scrawled in a hurried hand, a signature that matched Rafael's shortened. The sight of Rafael's handwriting on a torn corner flipped the mood the way a hand flips a card. Rafael, Marco, colder than a desert night. You signed their receipt. You met him in the warehouse. You promised lines of control. The accusation landed like a thrown stone. Rafael opened his mouth and closed it. He looked at Marco, then at the paper, then at the wounded man. Emma watched everything as if checking items off a list. Evidence in hands shifted. Who had power? A new emotion surfaced in Emma. Disbelief that someone she had heard introduced as Marco's second could betray him, then a careful assessment of what that betrayal meant. Emma stepped out again so she could see Rafael's face. Rafael, she said softly, tell him why. Her voice wanted a reason. She had learned in small ways that people made terrible deals under pressure. She wanted the reasons so she could place human shape around the act. Rafael's reply was short. They threatened my sister. It came with a wet edge. His eyes darted to Sergio. They had a photo. Photos and threats are papers that change hands. Sergio, Rafael took the hand that paid more money. Isn't he the first to choose that way? His voice carried the casual cruelty of someone explaining an economy. Marco's hands found his weapon. He held it low, not for show. The circle tightened. He raised the gun on Rafael, as if pulling a wire. Every head turned. The desert seemed to shrink into the barrel's length. That movement marked the chapter as peak of danger and of possible revenge. Emma's heart hammered in precise, physical beats. Her palms sweated against her knees. She could feel the heat of Marco's anger through his coat. The gun's metal read as decision. A mid-chapter cliffhanger hit then. Before Marco squeezed, Emma stepped forward and inserted herself between weapon and accused. She put one hand on the barrel and one hand on Rafael's chest. Marco, she said, naming him again so he could not pretend the man with the gun was anyone else. Don't do this. Her voice shortened to 3 words that folded over one another and made silence instead of firing. The smallness of her action changed how the circle breathed. Marco hesitated. The motion of his finger loosened. He wanted a clean answer, a confession that could be punished. Instead he found Rafael's hands shaking and Emma's steady palms. He looked at the torn paper in Rafael's coat, at Ivo bleeding in the sand, at Sergio's cold smile. For a long moment there was only the hiss of tires and a low rumble coming from the other car's engine. Emma could see the calculus in Marco's face. She had seen his controlled fury before, the way he controlled silence with a gaze. Now she watched him choose. She watched his jaw declare as much. He put the gun down a fraction. Rafael. Marco slowly, you answer for this. But not like this. The tone forced Rafael to drop his eyes. You will tell me everything you did. Names, times. Who else knew? The decision rerouted the night's violence into something that smelled of interrogation instead of immediate blood. Sergio, who had been patient until the decision, stepped forward and spat. You let him live. He barked toward Marco. Marco, your men will think weakness. Your enemies will think the same. His argument produced 3 more sharp lines exchanged between him and Marco, and his men shifted their weight in obvious disagreement. The rawness of Sergio's tone pulled at Marco's old rules. Emma felt the old rulebook, kill to keep order, pull at him as well. Marco answered Sergio with a single, controlled sentence. You want rules. Sergio, you want demonstration. But you're the one who came with guns instead of questions. The rebuke landed hard. Sergio's face darkened. Rafal swallowed and, with Emma still between him and the barrel, began to speak in broken bursts. He named warehouses, nights of handoffs, and a broker who had taken money in cash. The words came as concrete items. Addresses, times, ledger entries. Emma listened and remembered the torn letter with its blood smear from earlier. She pictured the paper sliding into Rafal's palm. With each name Rafal offered, the power dynamics shifted. Marco ordered his men to hold positions. He Rafal to kneel and then to stand. He demanded receipts and he demanded names. The interrogation turned the desert into a ledger. Emma realized her earlier suspicion had been correct. The night had been set up from inside. That made everything sharper, angrier, and more complicated. At one point Rafal paused and met Emma's eyes. "I didn't want to," he said. "They showed me a photo of my sister. They de-burn her place down." He spat the last words like an apology, and a confession rolled together. Emma saw raw fear in him, the same fear that had tightened her throat at the pullout. That shared fear changed how she felt about him. Another external event. Sergio's men began to leave the immediate circle, but not the area. They adjusted, wrapped up their hoods, and retreated in a way that read like a bargaining move. Sergio stayed. He leveled his stare at Marco and said, "You think you can interrogate me into leaving?" He mimed a threat with his head. The moment introduced a new pressure. If Marco didn't arrange a visible response, Sergio would interpret it as weakness and escalate later. Emma's actions remained deliberate. She moved between Marco and Rafal again, steadying the accused man's arm when he wobbled. She used short statements to shape the scene. "Marco, listen to what he says," she said. "We need who did this, not who dies for it tonight." Her voice kept sentences tight. Marco's eyes flicked to her often, reading her not for weakness but for the kind of steadiness that had once slowed his worst temper. He had already called her perfect in an earlier, different moment, words she dismissed then. Now his attention landed on how she stopped men and how she kept questions simple. Rafal's confession continued. He named a ledger where payments had been annotated. He of a small folded receipt with a clipped accession number. Marcos Lieutenant Rafal had left a glove on the wounded man. The glove had Rafal's sigil sewn into the seam. That glove, found near the wounded man's hand, turned the finger of blame inward. The discovery changed everything into betrayal rather than simple rivalry. Sergio stepped back as Marco barked for Rafal to hand over names. Then Sergio did something that shocked the circle. He laughed. It was short and sharp. "You think this ends with names? Sergio, you think you can make a list and walk back into the city and pretend this did happen?" He glanced toward his car like a man who had more cards to play. The laughter cracked the fragile balance. Emma forced the next move. She pulled a small cloth from her satchel and offered it to Ivo, who could not stop coughing. The act was concrete and immediate. "Here," she said, "wet it. Press here." She showed Rafal how to fold the cloth. The physical care deflected part of the emotional whirl. It reminded the men that a human body needed tending even in the middle of a negotiation. The gesture shifted attention from rhetorical threats to bodies and concrete needs. That care made Marco speak differently. He issued orders that were specific. "Move Ivo to the passenger side. Rafal, get his statement. Call the hospital on the way back." Marco set terms for a temporary truce. He named a time and a place for further reckoning. Sergio accepted under protest. He wanted blood, but his men were tired and the light toward Vegas had thinned to a pale rim. Emma continued to ask questions that mattered. Who else had the ledger? Who else knows the warehouse times? She kept her sentences short. Rafal named 2 more men, and Rafal named a broker who frequented an old diner on the strip. Each new name rewrote the night into an intelligence map, rather than a single act of violence. By the time dawn pulled a thin pink over the desert horizon, the immediate threat had been diffused into a set of terms. Marco lowered his weapon entirely and slid it back into his holster. Sergio to pull his men back 500 yards and to leave one man as a guard while the rest withdrew. Sergio agreed, but not without a last line. "You owe me a demonstration, Marco," he said. "Don't make me come for it later." Marco answered with a calibrated silence and a single phrase. "Not tonight." The final shift in the chapter's emotion moved toward a fragile truce and guarded curiosity. Emma felt relief that was threaded with an aftertaste of unease. She realized that the wound in Marco was not only physical or territorial, it was a rulebook torn from the inside. The torn, blood-smeared letter found near Ivo had Rafael S. shortened and a broker S. stamp. It suggested that control had been negotiated like property. Emma folded that logic into how she would walk back into the city with Marco. Back inside the sedan, the car smelled of tobacco and cold leather again. Marco drove with deliberate, small motions. He kept his hands on the wheel with a steadiness that willed the road to be regular. Emma sat beside him, the letter folded flat on the dashboard where the warm amber light spilled across it. She could see Rafael in the rear view, pale and shaken. She could see Sergio's car receding with an angry line. The city lights grew nearer. The ledger of names and receipts sat quiet on the dash. Marco spoke once, a short sentence. "Rafael will give me every name tonight. He will tell me who else signed, who else collected." His voice held a weight that was not solely the threat of punishment. It held the mechanical decision of a man who would rework his network. Emma listened. She felt the book of rules shift in her hands the way a seam tears and is resumed. Emma reached for the folded letter and smoothed it with her palm. The paper had been creased, stained with a rust-colored smear, and stamped with a broker's mark she'd never seen before. She read 2 lines aloud, soft but clear. 1 delivery, payment upon receipt. She looked at Marco. It names dates and times, not reasons. She closed the letter. "This means someone within your circle wanted a trade, not war." Marco did not argue. He let a sentence stand as fact. They drove the last stretch toward Las Vegas in a muted exchange of glances. Marco kept his eyes on the road. Emma kept her hands folded in her lap. Neither spoke a long summation of what had been resolved. Instead they acted. Marco called Rafael by name and told him to prepare a ledger and to gather the receipts mentioned in his confession. Rafael, his punishment would be to make the ledger public to Marco alone and to deliver names. That decision kept immediate blood from being drawn and turned punishment into accountability within the circle. It changed how Marco would govern. When they crossed the first signs of neon, Emma felt the night's edges soften but not close. The truce sat like a set of instructions to follow rather than a promise. Marco pulled into a quiet service lane and stopped. He switched off the engine. He reached into the pocket of his coat and drew a single folded letter he had taken from Rafael earlier and placed it on the dashboard beside Emma's. Marco's hand hovered above it for a second. Then he tapped it twice with the heel of his hand before dropping his fingers. "Keep it where I can see it, Marco." His voice carried no tenderness and no excess threat. It carried a command that also offered a shape. "Look at the proof and remember this moment." Emma slid the letter a fraction so the warm amber light scored its crease. She felt the chapter's conflicts resolved into a set of actions. Rafael would talk, Sergio would withdraw, and Marco would rewrite his enforcement to include interrogation before execution. Before they left the service lane, Marco opened the glove compartment and took out a steaming paper cup. Someone had left it warm in the car. He handed it to Emma. "Drink this," he said. "You will need it." She accepted. The steam fogged the edge of the windshield. The gesture was small and immediate. It held no promise beyond that cup and that hour. They pulled back onto the strip with the folded letter between them. Emma reached across and tapped the paper with one finger. "This proves the inside move," she said. "Keep Rafael close. Make him show you everything." Marco nodded once. Then he started the car and they drove toward the courthouse lights and toward a night waiting to be unspooled into questions. The concrete decisions they had made at the desert edge No immediate killing, full names, a ledger of receipts, hospital calls. Moved the plot from raw revenge to systemized retribution. As the city swallowed them into its glow, the chapter ended on a practical note. Marco set a time to meet Rafael in the morning at his safe house. He Emma to wait at the hotel until he called. Emma watched the folded letter one last time and then slid it into the satchel next to her keys. The car hummed beneath them. The desert light retreated. The night had been resolved by choices made in the open, and those choices would demand more work in daylight. The last thing Emma felt before sleep stole her in the back of the car was the paper under her hand and Marco's steadying attention ahead. Emotion route. Fear shaped Emma's early moves, then shifted into suspicion and finally into a guarded steadiness. The chapter closed with the practical aftermath. A timed meeting, a ledger to be examined, and one folded letter left on the dashboard as proof and as a summons to what would come next.